Okay, so in this lesson, we're going to talk about the difference quotient. Now, the difference quotient measures the slope. It measures the slope of a secant line, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But it measures the slope of a secant line, and it's tied in to calculus in terms of the derivative. But in this course, you don't deal with any of that. You don't deal with derivatives. You don't even have to know anything about about the fact that the difference quotient measures the slope of a secant line. You just have to be able to compute it to figure out what it's equal to. So the difference quotient looks like this. It has a numerator and denominator, and the numerator is f of x plus h minus f of x. Now, in a previous lesson, remember you found function values at x plus h. And then so this is saying that once you find f of x plus h, you then subtract the function from it, and then all that's being divided by h. Now this means something. All right, so it does mean something. And now let's kind of talk about how this comes about, rather than just telling you memorize this and that's called the difference quotient. But let's think about where it comes from. So if I'm looking at a function, and let's say this right here is my function. All right, I'm making this up. All right, let's say that's my function. And so the difference quotient measures the slope of a secant line. And a secant line is a line, and I'm going to try and make sure it's not going to work out very well the way I have it. So a secant line is a line, let me go ahead and do it like this, in which intersects the graph twice. So it looks something like this. All right, and it didn't work out very well. So it intersects the graph here, let's say, and it intersects the graph here. Now, don't confuse that with a tangent line. So there's something called a tangent line in which it intersects the graph just once, or touches the graph once. So this right here is my x-coordinate. All right, let's call this x. And then I am going to go to the right h units, whatever those units are. It could be 2, 2.7, 3, 3.7, I don't know. But h units up until I get to this point right here. Okay? And so this is x, and I go h more units to the right, then this point here, this x-coordinate, then has to be x plus h. So for example, if this is 5, I'm making this up, so if this is 5, if x is 5 here, and then this distance here is, let's say, 3, then do you agree that that's going to be x-coordinate 8? 5 plus 3 is 8. So if this is x, and I go h units to the right, then that's going to be x plus h. So let's call this right here, and remember, this is my function f of x. So when this coordinate is x, then this y-coordinate here is f of x. So let's just call it f of x. And so if my x-coordinate here is x plus h, then my y-coordinate will be f of x plus h. All right, so that's going to be this point here. All right, now remember, the difference quotient measures the slope of the secant line, so we're talking about slope. So remember, slope is rise over run. All right, rise over run. Now this point here, right here, that's going to be the point. The x-coordinate here is this x-coordinate, so that's x plus h. And this y-coordinate is just f of x. All right, and this x-coordinate here is x plus h. That's why you see an x plus h. And the y-coordinate will be f of x plus h. So, for example, if this is 8, I'm making this up. So that if this x-coordinate is 8, then the y-coordinate will be f of 8. All right, so if x is 8, again, I'm trying to make a connection between this and this. If x is 8, then y would be f of 8. Okay. All right. So remember, slope is rise over run. So my rise, to find your rise, you subtract the y coordinates. So that's going to be f of x plus h. Subtract this y coordinate, which is f of x, all over the run, and the run is this distance here. So that's just h. And so that's where this difference quotient comes from. All right, so it's a very rough sketch of trying to explain where this formula comes from, but it comes from the slope of a secant line. All right, and it ties into calculus next semester, or whenever you take either business calculus or calculus for science majors. All right, so let's look at some problems dealing with this. Now, when you do these problems, it's very important that you don't do anything mathematically incorrect. It is very easy. I've seen students just do the numerator, and then all of a sudden do something that's divided by h. You got to do the steps that I'm showing you to be mathematically correct. If any of these steps are not mathematically correct, you will lose points because it's not mathematically correct. You have to make sure you're showing all the work as it needs to be shown. Okay? So here's how the directions will say. The directions will say find the difference quotient of each of the following. Find the difference quotient of each of the following. All right, so here are your functions. These are the following functions. And it can be f of x, g of x, h of x, it doesn't matter, but we're going to use f of x here since the formula uses the notation f here. Okay, so first one's going to be this. We're going to start with a simple one. So let's say my function is f of x equal 3x minus 5. All right, 3x minus 5. Now, you have to do this algebraically. Don't use any calculus in here. So some students, they remember things from a previous high school course in terms of maybe advanced math or calculus, and they use those ideas. You have to be able to do this algebraically. So find the difference quotient, and I need this algebraically. Okay? All right. So find the difference quotient of each of the following. Okay. So first, remember the difference quotient is this. So let's go back over. The difference quotient is f of x plus h minus f of x. So remember that's your rise. So your rise, that comes from this. Remember your rise is a change in y coordinates. So from here to here. So it's the f of x plus h subtract f of x. So that's where the numerator comes from. And your run is just this distance here from here to here, and we call that h. All over h. All right, so first thing you're going to do is this. If you want to do it in steps, you would say this. You got to find this first. Okay? All right, so listen carefully. So you're going to do the numerator, and then at each step, you're going to say divide by h. So listen carefully. This is one approach you can take. So remember, f of x plus h, if all you do is cover this part up and you find this like we did in the previous lessons, so this means that wherever we see the function, wherever we see the variable x, you're going to plug in x plus h. That's what that means. So you're going to say f of x plus h minus f of x all over h will equal, okay, now let's do it with the numerator. 3 times x plus h minus 5. So that's this part here. Make sure you understand that that's this part. Okay? Then you're going to subtract f of x. So then you're going to say minus f of x. Now be careful. If you say this, that's incorrect. That's mathematically incorrect because you're only subtracting 3x. This says I got to subtract the whole function. So you got to subtract all of this because look, if you don't, this says minus 3x minus 5. And at some point you're going to have an error. You got to say minus all of this. And then you would distribute this. Okay? And then you say all over h. So make sure you understand that this right here is this. So f of x plus h means that you go to your function f, and where we see the variable x, you plug in x plus h. So notice 3 times x plus h minus 5. So that's this part here. Okay? So make sure you understand this. Okay? It can be difficult to see this. So let's think of it this way as well. So f of x equal 3x minus 5. So remember, step one would be to find f of x plus h, just like we did in a previous lesson. So think of it like this. Step one is this, and then you come back and you fill it in. So step one says, I go to my function f, and where we see the variable, I plug in x plus h. All right, so that's step one. So we get 3 times x plus h minus 5, and that's what you see here. All right, that's what you see here. So if you need to actually write out something like a step 1 and then put it back. And then step 2 would be where, I don't know if you want to put a step 2 here because it becomes too much for you. But then it says whatever step 1 is, I got to take away f of x. So do it like this if you need to. Some of you can just go ahead from here, think about what you have and write it out correctly. And then don't forget to subtract in parentheses this function. Some of you can do that. Others of you may have to do this little part here like we did in a previous lesson. All right, so that goes here. And now you're going to take away f of x. Don't forget to put f of x in parentheses, though, all over h. All right, now distribute. Distribute here and distribute here. All right, now watch what you get. 3 times x is 3x. 3 times h is 3h. Minus 5, that's a 5. And now distribute the negative 1 here, so that becomes minus 3x, and then negative 1 times negative 5 is a positive 5, all over h. Combine like terms. 3x minus 3x is 0. 5 and a negative 5 is 0, and you're left with 3h over h. And then notice that the h's divide out, and you're left with 3. So your answer in the blank, you're going to say f of x plus h minus f of x all over h equals 3. And that's your work. That's the work you got to show. You got to say divide by h, divide by h, divide by h each time. All right, don't be lazy and leave these h's off and all of a sudden have an h here. It is mathematically incorrect. This right here, this difference quotient, you have to have a numerator and a denominator at each step. Numerator, denominator, and then reduce at the end. All right, so think what's mathematically correct so you don't lose any points on any of this. You gotta be able to do this correctly. All right, now if you are doing it correctly, look what's going to happen with the difference quotient. When you use the difference quotient, what's going to happen is this. See at this point where I crossed some stuff out? Notice that the only thing left was the term with an h in it that had a factor of h. See this term here had a factor of h? None of these other terms had a factor of h. You're going to notice that as we go through all of these, that's always going to cancel out. And the only thing left will be the factor with the term, rather, with a factor of h. So you know you're doing it correctly when you cancel out all these other terms. Okay? All right, let's look at another. All right, so there's going to be letter B. All right, letter B. Suppose you had f of x equal negative 8x plus 5. All right, so we do a linear one, and then we're going to do the quadratic. The quadratic, when we're involved, that's the one you need to be able to do. But let's look at this again. Let's do a linear function. So we got to find f of x plus h minus f of x all over h. Now remember, that's called the difference quotient. Rise over run. That's the slope of a secant line. Okay, so step 1 would be to find this. Now some of you can go directly, write it out just like we did here. Others of you may have to do this, and that's fine. So others of you may have to do this. You may have to say, all right, my function is this, and my step 1, I got to find f of x plus h, just like I did in the previous lesson. So wherever you see the variable x, I'm going to plug in x plus h. Wherever you see the variable x, I'm going to plug in x plus h. So I'm going to get negative 8 times x plus h plus 5. And that goes, that right here goes for this one. So it'll be negative 8 times x plus h minus 5. So that's this right here. And then you got to subtract, in parentheses, your function. Make sure you remember it's in parentheses. It's got to be in parentheses. It says, notice if you did not, we talked about this a while ago. Remember, if you had not put parentheses here, that would have been minus 3x minus 5. And notice that would have been minus 5. Those 5s would not have canceled out. So you got to put that in parentheses because you're subtracting the whole term. You're subtracting the whole function every term. So it's minus 3x plus 5. All right, so the parentheses are important because you're subtracting the whole function. So I'm subtracting negative 8x plus 5. And all over h, you have to say all over h. If you don't say all over h, if you're lazy and you don't want to write it, you're going to lose some points. So you must say over h, because that's what this is. rise over run. Okay, now I'm going to distribute. Now let's see what happens. Negative 8x. Negative 8 times h is a negative 8h minus 5. A negative 1 times a negative 8x is a positive 8x. And always check yourself. Hopefully these are opposites, and they are. Negative 8x, positive 8x. And then a negative 1 times a positive 5 is a negative 5. Oh, I'm sorry, right here. See, I was going back and say, make sure they're opposites, and they're not. So you see what the error was? My error was this was plus 5, and what do I put here? Minus 5. So you can always check yourself. See, I made a mistake. That's plus 5. Now they're opposites, so they'll cancel out all over h. All right, so these cancel out, these cancel out, so you're left with negative 8h over h, and then reduce, the h's divide out, and you're left with negative 8. So that's what this is. So f of x plus h minus f of x over h equals negative 8. So that's what the difference quotient is. So the difference quotient for this function is negative 8. All right. So the difference quotient of f of x, which equals negative 8x plus 5, is negative 8. All right. Okay. So let's look at C. So let's look at a quadratic function. All right. Suppose I had this function, f of x equal x squared minus 3x plus 4. F of x equal x squared minus 3x plus 4. So I want to find the difference quotient. I want to find the difference quotient for this function. I want to find f of x plus h minus f of x over h. Now this may be a good idea to go ahead and actually do the step 1 on here. Do that step so you can do the work. So in other words, f of x is x squared minus 3x plus 4. And you got to find this little part first. This is the hard part. Not the hard part, but that's the part that's going to take you the longest to do, because all the others just follows from here. This is the one you got to do some stuff with. So let's find step 1. Let's find f of x plus h. So think about what we did earlier in a previous lesson. Wherever you see the variable x, I'm going to plug in x plus h. All right, so that's going to be a lot of work here. So kind of do the side. So you're going to say x plus h squared minus 3 times x plus h plus 4. So that's f of x plus h. So where you saw the variable x, you plugged in x plus h. So x plus h squared minus 3 times x plus h plus 4. All right, so that's going to go here. So watch carefully. That's going to go here. X plus h squared minus 3 times x plus h plus 4. Now remember, that's just this. Okay, this right here is this. That's what we just found. All right, now you got to subtract f of x. So you got to subtract your function. So put that in parentheses. So my function's just this. X squared minus 3x plus 4. And all of that's being divided by 4. By h. Okay, now you got to do some work. So remember in a previous lesson when we squared x plus h? So remember when we squared x plus h, go off right here and do it. Remember what that is? So that means x plus h times x plus h. So if I use the FOIL method, I'm multiplying two binomials. I'm going to get x squared plus xh plus another xh plus h squared. So I get x squared, and I get two xh's, two of them, and then plus h squared. All right, so that right here is this. Okay, so I'm going to get equal. I'm just going to rewrite this over. Okay, I'm going to rewrite this right here. So that's x squared plus 2xh plus h squared. So remember, that's this. This is this. Then I'm going to distribute this. So here you're going to distribute. So that'll be minus 3x minus 3h plus 4. All right, so make sure you see what's happening. So I'm going to FOIL this. I'm going to get this. Now remember, this will always be the same. X plus h squared is always going to equal this trinomial. distribute the negative 3, I get this, and then the 4. Now we can distribute the negative 1. Distribute this negative 1. Okay, so when I do that, I'm going to get minus x squared. A negative 1 times the negative 3x is a positive 3x, and a negative 1 times a positive 4 is a negative 4, all over h. All right, now look at this. Remember what we talked about. At that point, if you're doing this correctly, every term that does not have an h, every term that does not have a factor of an h, it should cancel out. So in other words, you see this x squared? There's no factor of h. So there better be a negative x squared somewhere, and it is. It's right here. So those cancel out. This has an h in it, so it's going to stay. This has an h in it, so it's going to stay. See this term? There's no factor of h. So its opposite better be somewhere else, and it is. It's right here. So when I add them up, that's 0. This has a factor of h in it, so it stays. This that does not have a factor of h, its opposite better be somewhere else, and it is. So when I add those up, it cancels out. So notice what's left. What's left is this. Everything that's left has a factor of h. So write it out. You're going to say this, 2xh plus h squared minus 3h, all over h. So that's where I'm at. Okay? Now, you got to remember something from last semester when you factored. If you look at the numerator, what does every term in the numerator have in common? Well, every term in the numerator has a factor of h. So that means I can factor out an h. So I can do this. I can say h times 2x plus h minus 3 all over h. So again, we're using factoring. You got to factor the numerator. So when I factor the numerator, I'm going to take out the GCF. So the GCF here is h. Now notice the h's divide out. And then you're left with 2x plus h minus 3. So that's your difference quotient. So the answer you're going to say, f of x plus h minus f of x all over h is going to equal 2x plus h minus 3. Now in calculus, this does mean something. It means that the slope of the secant line is this expression. And you're going to see how to deal with this next semester. All right, so notice the work. So there's quite a little bit of stuff here. Notice the amount of work. Notice that this is mathematically correct. Every step is mathematically correct. This step does equal this. This step does equal this. And so on. Okay? All right, and that's your difference quotient. The difference quotient for this function is 2x plus h minus 3. All right, let's look at another quadratic function. Okay, D. Suppose we had f of x is equal to 2x squared minus 6x minus 3. So 2x squared minus 6x minus 3. And I want to find the difference quotient for this function. So I want to find the secant, the slope of the secant of this function. All right, so I want to find f of x plus h minus f of x over h. So we're looking at the difference quotient. So remember, the difference quotient is the slope. Remember that slope, rise over run, slope of the secant line at any 2 points. All right, so let's do that step 1. So your step 1. So let's think about that step 1. Let's do it on this page. So your step 1, remember, is this. Let me go ahead and rewrite the function. This was a function. It was 2x squared minus 6x minus 3. All right, so step 1 is to find this f of x plus h. All right, and so remember, all it does is it tells me I go to my function, and wherever we see the variable x, I see it twice. I'm going to plug I'm going to plug in x plus h. So I get 2 times x plus h squared. All right, so 2 times x plus h squared. So remember, 2x squared. In place of that x, I plug in x plus h. Minus 6 times x. Put that in parentheses. Remember, always put this in parentheses. Notice the parentheses. Each time, notice the parentheses. X plus h. And then minus 3. Okay? Now, remember, an error, we talked about this in a previous lesson, that previous part. Is it okay to distribute here? The answer is no, because you're squaring. Is it okay to distribute here? The answer is yes, because this binomial is being raised to the first power. Okay, so x plus h to the first is x plus h, and then I multiply. Here, I've got to square first. Remember, you use your order of operations. So the order of operations says I got to do exponents before I multiply. All right, so I have to figure out this little part here first. Okay, but let's think about this part here. So this right here is going to be this whole thing. All right, so that's f of x plus h. So I get 2 times x plus h squared minus 6 times x plus h minus 3. So make sure you understand that this is all of this. Okay, that is this. But then I got to subtract f of x. So subtract f of x. Notice always put that in parentheses. Now your f of x here, your function is this trinomial. So I get 2x squared minus 6x minus 3. All of that's being divided by h. You must say divide by h. You must say that because that's what this is. My denominator is an h. It has a denominator. Show it. It is h. Okay, so now, just like I did here, just like I did this, I got to multiply this out. All right, so what you're going to do next is this. You're going to figure out what this part is first. You can't distribute. You got to square first and then distribute. But remember, x plus h squared, you already know what that is. Now, if you don't, work it out. Work it out. So let's figure out what x plus h squared is. So remember, x plus h squared means x plus h times itself. X plus h squared means x plus h times itself. And then FOIL. X times x is x squared. The outer is xh. The inner is another xh. And the last is h squared. Notice we keep doing the same thing. Go back to the previous ones. See, go back to all the ones that you have to square x plus h, and it's all the same thing. So you're always going to get x squared plus 2xh plus h squared. Now that's what this is right here. So now I'm going to say 2 times this whole thing though. Okay, x squared. So 2 times all of this. So that's x squared plus 2xh plus h squared. All right, and then let's go ahead and distribute this at this point. So that's minus 6x minus 6h. That's an x. And then minus 3, don't forget the minus 3, and then distribute the negative 1. I'm going to get minus 2x squared. A negative 1 times a negative 6x is a positive 6x. And then negative 1 times a negative 3 is a positive 3 all over h. Now distribute the 2. Distribute the 2, and I get 2x squared plus 4xh plus 2h squared. 2 times all of this is this. Now rewrite everything else. Minus 6x minus 6h minus 3 minus 2x squared plus 6x plus 3 all over h. Now at that point, remember, is where you start canceling stuff out. You see this right here? There's no factor of h. Its opposite better be somewhere else, and it is. It's right here. So that means when I add them up, they cancel. A 2x squared and a negative 2x squared is 0. This has an h, this has an h, this is not. So its opposite better be somewhere, and it is. It's right here. So that means when I add them up, I get a 0. This has a factor of h, this does not. So the opposite of negative 3 better be somewhere, and it is. So that means that when I add these up, I get 0. So what's left, remember always, what is left will be only terms that have a factor of h in it. So I'm going to have 4xh plus 2h squared minus 6h over h. And then one more step and you're done. So remember, at this point is where you factor the numerator. So that means I can take out an h and it's going to divide out with this. So that means I'm going to get h times 4x plus 2h minus 6 all over h. And now these divide out and you're left with your answer, which is 4x plus 2h minus 6. So that's your answer. So that's the difference quotient of that function. So the difference quotient of f of x, which equals 2x squared minus 6x minus 3, is 4x plus 2h minus 6. Now, this means something, so you're going to see how to apply this next semester. Now, on the worksheet, it's going to say f of x plus h minus f of x over h equals blank. You're going to put this in the blank. So you can put 4x plus 2h minus 6. So that's the difference quotient for that function that we're looking at. All right, so notice the steps. A lot of steps. Notice the steps. Show all this work. Don't be lazy because you're not going to be very happy. You have to mathematically show the steps. Okay, let's do one more with a quadratic function, and then hopefully you'll be able to understand how to do this algebraically. So, let's say your function is negative 3x squared plus 6x minus 1. All right, so you're going to find the difference quotient. So find f of x plus h. Now, it's going to say find the difference quotient. It's going to say this. Find the difference quotient for f of x. That's what it's going to say. You have to know the difference quotient, the formula for the difference quotient is this. So f of x plus h minus f of x all over h. All right, so that's what you're going to be told. This is what you have to think of in your mind. Well, if I want to find the difference quotient for my function f, then this is what I got to use. All right, so we got to do this little part first, that f of x plus h. So that's kind of when we went to this little page here. Okay, remember that? So we go to e. F of x is negative 3x squared plus 6x minus 1. So we're going to find f of x plus h. So remember what that means is that in place of x, I'm going to substitute x plus h. So that's what that means. So I'm going to get negative 3 times, in parentheses, x, which I'm substituting with x plus h, but that's being squared, plus 6 times x plus h, replace x with x plus h, and then minus 1. So that's going to go here. So that's going to equal, and remember this part right here is just this. So I found this part. So that part I'm going to rewrite now. So that's going to be, look how it looks. Just rewrite it how it looks. Don't distribute the negative 3 because remember you got to square first. All right. Now here you can distribute the 6 because that's x plus h to the first power. So x plus h to the first is just x plus h times 6. This you got to square. You got to FOIL this out. All right. So I'm going to just go ahead and rewrite it though. So negative 3 times x plus h squared plus 6 times x plus h minus 1. Now remember, all this right here represents is what I have circled. The next step is you guys subtract your function. So subtract. So always do this. And my function is this. So negative 3x squared plus 6x minus 1 all over h. Okay, now let's follow this out. So remember, we've already done that. X plus h squared, remember, is this. It's just right here. Okay, so I'm going to rewrite this as this now. Negative 3 times x squared plus 2xh plus h squared. So this right here is this. That is this. All right, don't forget I'm multiplying it by negative 3. All right, let's go ahead and distribute the 6. So I'm going to get, don't forget your division. So I'm going to get plus 6x plus 6h minus 1. And then here, I'm going to distribute the negative 1. And I'm going to get negative 1 times negative 3x squared is a positive 3x squared. Negative 1 times a positive 6x is a negative 6x. And a negative 1 times a negative 1 is a positive 1. All over h. And then I'm going to distribute the negative 3 here. And I'm going to get negative 3 times x squared is a negative 3x squared. Negative 3 times a positive 2xh is a negative 6xh. Negative 3 times h squared is a negative 3h squared. And then rewrite everything else over. Plus 6x plus 6h minus 1 plus 3x squared minus 6x plus 1. All over h. Make sure you say all over h. All right, now it's at this point. Remember what happens at this point. All right, it's at this point that every term that doesn't have a factor of h will cancel out with its opposite somewhere else. So you see there's no factor of h here. So negative 3x squared, there better be a positive 3x squared, and there is. So that means that when I add these up, I get 0. This has a factor of h, this has a factor of h, this does not. So 6x, there better be a negative 6x somewhere, and there is. So when I add those up, I get 0. This has a factor of h, this does not. A negative 1, there better be a positive 1, and there is. So every term that's left has a factor of h. So what's left is a negative 6xh minus 3h squared plus 6h all over h. And then you want this to reduce with the GCF up here. So factor out the GCF. You take out an h, so you're left with negative 6x. H times negative 6x minus 3h, because h times a negative 3h is a negative 3h squared. And then plus 6, because h times 6 is 6h. All over h. And at that point, you reduce. And whatever you're left with is your answer. That's your difference quotient. So in the blank, you would say f of x plus h minus f of x all over h equals this right here, negative 6x minus 3h plus 6. Again, what we found is the slope of the secant line for this function here, for that function. So given any 2 points on that curve, I can use this formula to find the slope of the secant line. All right, so that's the end of that. So notice the one that you're probably going to, you need to be able to do the ones, especially with the quadratic function. You're not going to have, well, I'm not going to give you anything with cubic or anything raised to the 4th power because then it will take too long. In that case, you would just use calculus to do that. All right, so there's the lesson on finding the difference quotient of a function. Find the difference quotient of a function. Remember, the difference quotient is it measures the slope of a secant line. And remember, the slope is rise or run, so that's how it came about. Here's your difference quotient, f of x plus h minus f of x over h. All right, so that's the end of this lesson.